Hi, everyone. We are going to be learning about today the initiatives to promote healthy eating in Australia. So, this includes the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which within that involves the Australian Dietary Guidelines, the work of Nutrition Australia. Within that, we look at the healthy eating pyramid and then the challenges in bringing about dietary change, as we know that dietary change is not an easy thing to fix, and there are many factors that contribute to this. So, the key skill for this topic is draw conclusions as to why dietary improvements are difficult to achieve in Australia. So, when we are looking at this, it encompasses the Australian Dietary Guidelines and the work of Nutrition Australia, like the Healthy Eating Pyramid, are all things that have been introduced to help improve our diets. So, and then we know that always that dietary change is not very easy to achieve. It can be difficult. So it's around looking at what are some of these factors that contribute to people not changing their diet and not following these things that have been introduced by the government or other organisations, such as the dietary guidelines. So let's start with the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. So this particular model reflects Australian Dietary Guidelines 2 and 3, as Guideline 2 is around enjoying a wide variety of nutritious foods from the 5 food groups, which we can see the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating is a reflection of that. And Guideline 3 is around limiting the intake of added salt, added sugar, alcohol, and saturated fat, which again is reflected in the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. So you really need to know how to describe this model. And it's a guide, a food selection guide, which visually represents the proportion of the 5 food groups recommended for consumption each day. So that's an overall definition. You don't have to have that word for word, but if you were asked to describe that model, you need to have a really good description that sums up that it's showing the 5 food groups and maybe something that it's represented as a pie chart with foods in their 5 food groups recommended for consumption. And it's a visual tool as well. So you need to know how it works to promote healthy eating or reduce disease. So disease could be obesity, CVD, type 2 diabetes. You might get something completely different than that. So, for example, if you were asked to explain how the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating could be used to reduce obesity, you could talk about how it's represented in a pie chart, and the foods in the largest section of the pie chart include grains and vegetables. Vegetables are lower calories, so consuming higher amounts of these, as recommended by the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, would mean less calories in the diet and therefore could reduce obesity. You could also talk about how there's discretionary food items outside of the pie chart, which again encourage limited consumption of these, which are usually energy dense, which therefore reduces obesity. So it's really around using that specific language of not just saying the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating reduces obesity because it's encouraging us to eat 5 food groups. You need to be super specific with your terminology to show your understanding of the model and what it is representing. So, what you need to know for this particular skill, like I highlighted on the previous slide, you need to be able to describe the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. You need to be able to explain how it could promote healthy eating or be used to reduce a specific disease and just apply that to whatever you get in a question. And you need to understand each section of the pie chart and use this specific terminology throughout your responses, including the information outside of the pie chart. That is all included as well. So let's have a look at our key skill in action. So this is a past SAC or exam question that I have sourced. Describe how the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating may promote health in relation to obesity. So I've got the steps here and where the marks would be allocated. So step 1 is you need to use your knowledge of describing an element of the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. Remember, not just using it as an overall thing, really using that specific terminology. Step 2 here, you need to explain how it helps reduce obesity. Step 3, for this question, it's asking you may promote health. Health can be health status or health and well-being. So here is a sample answer for you. So the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating shows energy-dense foods like sweetened drinks and biscuits in the bottom corner and advises people to consume them in only sometimes and in small amounts. So that's your description, your element of the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. This can reduce energy intake and the risk of obesity among children. So there's my step 2. Reducing obesity would mean children would be at a healthier body weight, improving physical health and well-being. So really the most important thing to take note of here is the yellow of how I've been very specific with the language and terminology that I have used. So moving on to the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So remember, these guidelines 2 and 3 are reflected in the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which hopefully you can see that link really easily. So you might get a question that's specifically on the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, or you might get a question that's asking you to choose 2 or choose 1 dietary guideline and explain how it could be used to promote healthy eating or to reduce obesity or improve reduce prevalence of CVD in Australia. You could get a whole range of different diseases. So same advice as before, knowing each of the guidelines is a necessity. So that's just putting them on flashcards, remembering them. You can't really leave out words because it might change the meaning of that guideline or take away from its effectiveness. So, for example, for guideline 3, if you had something like limiting the intake of fat, salt, sugar, if you don't have saturated fat, well, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat should be included in your diet because they have lots of health benefits. And if you just said limiting of foods containing saturated fat and you missed the rest of the sentence, that's not the full guideline. So I would just encourage you to remember these. So yeah, you need to know all 5 of these. 1, 2, and 3 are going to be the most utilized throughout your responses. So again, you really need to delve deep into what these are, and if they were followed, what would that mean? So instead of just saying, if people follow guideline 2, they will enjoy a wide variety of nutritious foods from the 5 food groups, therefore reducing obesity or therefore promoting healthy eating. A better example would be if guideline 2 was followed, if you had to state it first. So you've got enjoy a wide variety of nutritious food groups from the following 5 food groups every day. And then going into, okay, so if that was actually followed, what does that look like? Well, the 5 food groups, like we looked at on the previous slide of the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, you could say the vegetables make up a large section of the pie chart, meaning they need to be consumed in larger amounts. Vegetables contain high amounts of fiber. Fiber contributes to fullness, which therefore can reduce obesity. Or you could say that vegetables contain a lot of antioxidants, which can reduce the incidence of cancers or can just help with overall body functioning, which can therefore promote healthy eating. So you're using a specific example from the pie chart. Okay, that is really important. For guideline 1, which isn't related to the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, if you're saying that if this guideline was followed, well, you could talk about if people follow this guideline, they would understand the importance of being physically active and therefore participate in more exercise. This could reduce weight gain and therefore reduce obesity. So really being specific with that terminology, that will separate you from just getting a mark to getting those full marks, because anyone can restate these guidelines. That's a really easy skill to learn. It's around choosing an element from that and going that little bit deeper. So again, following on from the last slide, knowing each guideline word for word is recommended here, because missing out on those keywords in the guidelines can end up meaning they mean something different, or you're just missing a key component of that. So another important thing to remember, if you're asked to state a guideline or put in a dietary guideline and you can't remember the guideline number, don't include it. If you just write out the guideline without the number, you'll still be able to receive marks. But if you put the wrong number in with the right guideline, you may lose a mark there. So if you can't remember, just don't put in the number. Like we've just gone over, you need to go into enough detail. If you're just restating the guideline, that is actually not meeting the skill. That's not going into why, if that guideline was followed, what would be the change that could come from that. So just keep that in mind, that if you're doing practice questions, read over it. Have you just restated the guideline and not actually gone into enough detail? Because you're not going to get marks there. Practice questions that link the guidelines to improving things like consumption of fruit and vegetables, reducing diet-related diseases. You can choose the question on the next slide and write your own questions, practicing to different diseases and things like that, so that you've got that skill and you're repeatedly exposing yourself to questions to practice drawing those key elements out of the guideline to ensure that you have enough detail. So let's take a look at this key skill in action. Healthy eating has emerged as a significant factor in relation to premature death and ill health in Australia. Identify 2 Australian dietary guidelines and explain how each may reduce the risk of premature death in Australia. So we've got our 4 steps here, which is breaking down where the marks are coming from. So step 1 is identifying one guideline. Remember, if you just write dietary guideline 3, you're not going to get marks. You need to write out the actual guideline. Then step 2, explain how following this guideline could reduce the risk of death. Step 3, you're identifying another guideline, again, writing it out, and then completing the same step. Explain how following this guideline could reduce the risk of death. You need to make sure you're not double dipping, so you're using 2 different examples. So I'll just read out the first example for you. So dietary guideline 3 advises to limit the intake of foods containing saturated fat, added salt, sugars, and alcohol. Fat, sugar, and alcohol contribute significant calories to the diet, so limiting their intake can reduce energy consumption and reduces the risk of obesity, which reduces the risk of premature death. So please notice that if lots of people will just stop at the yellow, they'll just say dietary guideline 3, they'll write it out and saying, therefore, following this guideline will reduce premature death because they're not consuming energy dense foods. You need to go into that extra bit of detail, which is what is in the green there. And you've got your second 2 marks there as well, which is looking at guideline 2. So keep coming back to this, using this as a worked example. And when you're practicing your answers, thinking to yourself, have I included enough detail in that middle part? Or again, have I just simply restated? Okay, so moving on to the next part of the skill is looking at Nutrition Australia. So the first thing to remember is the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating and Australian Dietary Guidelines are developed by the government. Nutrition Australia is non-government. So just important to be able to distinguish between the two, because if you got asked to explain a government organisation that's been used to promote healthy eating and you talk about Nutrition Australia, then that is incorrect. So Nutrition Australia is non-government. So Nutrition Australia is a body that acts to promote healthy eating by providing the latest information on nutrition research and current food and health and wellbeing trends. So what they do is then disperse all of this information via media campaigns and through their website and other forms of ways that people receive nutritional advice, and making sure that health professionals are going out to the general public and giving them this health information. They are also responsible for a range of resources and nutritional resources with the aim, again, for individuals to take more control over their health and learn about healthy eating. So all of the examples here is the work of Nutrition Australia. So specific examples of the work that they carry out. We're going to go into the healthy eating pyramid in more detail because you can get standalone specific questions relating to this. And then it's advised that you just go through each one of these and follow the worked example that I'll have on a following slide, which essentially is you need to know the role of Nutrition Australia and the work it carries out and how it promotes healthy eating. So again, it's around providing enough detail rather than just going into that really small amount of depth. So what do you need to know in terms of Nutrition Australia? So you need to be able to understand and be able to describe the overall role of Nutrition Australia and its aim, how Nutrition Australia promotes healthy eating or reduces disease. You should be able to start to see the double ups between everything we're doing with the dietary stuff is around how can it help promote healthy eating or reduce disease. And through this, you need to know specific examples of the work of Nutrition Australia and apply to the question, which is what we're about to do. So before we get into the healthy eating pyramid, because that is an example, what it says down there in the little note down the bottom, the healthy eating pyramid is an example of Nutrition Australia. But quite often I've seen questions where you'll have a question on the healthy eating pyramid, and then it might say, other than the healthy eating pyramid, explain the role of Nutrition Australia in the promotion of healthy eating. So you need to have other examples rather than just the healthy eating pyramid. So essentially, this is how you break down a question. So again, this is being broken down. You'd put it into a formal sentence. So I've chosen one of those bubbles on the previous slide, which is publication of recipes. I need to explain what that is. Nutrition Australia publishes hundreds of healthy recipes on the Nutrition Australia website, and there are cookbooks that are available to purchase. Having these recipes accessible means that people have ideas to include nutritious foods in their diet and increase the consumption of foods such as vegetables, which therefore promotes healthy eating in Australia. So again, it's just providing those kind of 3 steps of information and linking to whatever you get in the question. So this is promotion of healthy eating. If it was obesity, changing it to fit that. Okay, so what do you need to know for the healthy eating pyramid in terms of your checklist of do I understand what I need to do for this particular skill? You need to be able to describe it. Which organization developed it? Can you describe the layers and structures of the pyramid and what's located on the outside of the pyramid in that section? How does it promote healthy eating? How does it reduce disease? So same questions. So we were speaking about before, the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating is represented as a pie chart. This is represented as a pyramid. So again, we need to be really explicit with our language and our terminology of referencing each of the layers and the additional messages on the outside of the pyramid, which we are about to go into. So let's start off with our description. So the Healthy Eating Pyramid, or you can bracket it to HEP, it was developed by Nutrition Australia. So like we spoke about before, which is a non-government organisation. And that organisation the aim of that organisation is to promote healthy eating throughout Australia. So the pyramid itself contains the 5 core food groups plus healthy fats, according to how much they contribute to a balanced diet based on the Australian Dietary Guidelines. Okay, so they are all interconnected. So the layers of the pyramid are based on recommended food intake for approximately 19 to 50-year-olds. However, the proportions and the placement of each food group are generally applicable to all age groups. You don't need to know all of that, but it's just what's on the slide here is a good description for you. But just if you were asked a question to describe, you need to have a definition. So let's start with the foundation layers and make sure that you're taking notes because this is the specific terminology that you need to be and you're expected to be using throughout your responses when we start doing questions. So the foundation layers make up the largest proportion of the pyramid because plant foods should make up the largest proportion of our diet. So actually around 70% of what we eat. So the foundation layer includes vegetables and legumes, fruits and grains. So all of these foods contain a variety of vitamins and minerals and antioxidants, and they also are the main source of carbohydrates and fiber in our diet. So just keep that in mind with if you had to link to certain diseases or like reducing certain diseases or encouraging the consumption of certain things, think about these it's the pyramid is telling us, the foundation layer is telling us to consume these foods in the largest amounts. They have high levels of antioxidants. They've got high levels of fiber, high levels of carbohydrates. Think about what all those nutrients do for our body and how they help reduce the prevalence and incidence of diet-related diseases. So again, that's the specific knowledge and actually saying the words, the foundation layer. That is what I'm looking for in your responses. So the middle layer includes like our dairy options and then also some lean meat, poultry, fish, eggs, nuts, seeds, and those types of things. So think about the nutrients that are found in these foods. So calcium, protein, and other vitamins and minerals as well. So think about, again, an iron as well, B12 vitamins. And yeah, think about if we're applying this to a question, how, if you are following the advice from the healthy eating pyramid, how this middle layer could assist in promoting certain things or reducing disease. So getting to know the terminology for this section as well. Okay, so the top layer. So our top layer right at the top of the pyramid is referring to healthy fats. It is indicating that it's still required in our diet. It's still important, but it's required in small amounts. So it says there, we need healthy fats to support our heart health and brain function. We should choose foods that contain healthy fats instead of foods that contain saturated and trans fats, which will be outside of the pyramid. So again, it's encouraging the top layer. What I would say in a response, the top layer is encouraging the consumption of healthy fats, which is going to produce that HDL cholesterol, which is going to lower LDL cholesterol and flowing on like that. So again, getting to know the specific terminology for the top layer. Now, people always forget about these in their responses. So just because it's on the outside of the pyramid doesn't mean it's not included. So these are from the additional messages. So we've got choose water and limit added salt and sugar. There is also herbs and spices, but that's not very applicable to what we're doing. So again, it's telling you to choose water. So the additional message is to choose water. So it's promoting the consumption of water rather than sugary drinks, fruit juice, things like that, or sports drinks as well. It's then got a teaspoon with sugar and a salt shaker with a cross in it, which is telling us to limit our salt and added sugar intake. Again, think about if you had to apply that to something like CBD, obesity. So using language like in the additional messages section or on the outside of the pyramid, there is a box with a cross and a salt shaker and a teaspoon with sugar, which is showing us and giving a visual indication to limit added salt and sugar, etc. Okay, so again, writing down that specific terminology, being super, super clear that that is what you're referring to. I find the limiting added salt and sugar a really good one to link with in your responses, and the foundation layer. They're probably my two go-tos. I feel like we've covered this, so I'm just going to race through this. But again, your second exam skill for this, you're expected to use specific terminology in your responses when explaining how the healthy eating pyramid could be used to promote healthy eating or reduce disease. So again, when you're going over your answers and getting feedback, just read back your answers and saying, am I just being super basic here? Because remember, this is what we do in junior health. You're in year 12 health and human. How are you going deeper with your responses and showing that specific health terminology coming through? So you need to know the layers, the additional messages, and being able to explicitly link this throughout your responses. You also need to know how to describe the healthy eating pyramid, the aim of it, and the organization who developed this. Okay, let's look at a key skill in action here. So, explain how the healthy eating pyramid could be used to promote healthy eating in Australia. So, again, here is your step by step breakdown that you can keep coming back to. So, step one is you're using an example of the healthy eating pyramid. I've got brackets specific there because that's where we're looking for those buzzwords, that key health terminology. Step two, explain how this example could be used to promote healthy eating in Australia. And then we repeat the process again. So I'll read the first example for you. So the foundation layer of the healthy eating pyramid is the largest layer of the pyramid, meaning that grains, fruits and vegetables need to be consumed in the largest amounts. So there is my specific example showing my knowledge. Following this would mean that people are consuming large amounts of these foods, such as fruit and vegetables, that contain large amounts of antioxidants and essential nutrients, therefore promoting healthy eating in Australia. So then we go into our second example. This is cut off right now as I'm recording, but I know that I've put something in there around the additional messages. So additionally, the additional messages outside of the pyramid show a teaspoon of sugar with a cross in it and salt, which are encouraging us to limit these in our diet. So therefore, consuming less energy dense foods, which could be therefore promote healthy eating in Australia. I'm sorry if that's not exactly what I've written there. The recording thing has gone over the top. But again, there's two explicit examples that have shown my knowledge of the healthy eating pyramid. Okay, our last part of this skill is challenges in bringing about dietary change in Australia. So just think about it. The Australian Guide to Healthy Eating Pyramid, you probably knew they existed. Do you follow them? Are they effective? Why aren't they effective? Why is it so difficult for people to change their diets? People know that eating healthy food is important. People know that it causes disease. Why? What are the barriers? What are the blockers for people making changes to their diets, which is what we're going to explore now. Okay, so to complete this skill, what we're looking for is conclusions must be drawn as to why dietary improvements are difficult to achieve in Australia. So these are all the factors that contribute to challenges for carrying out dietary change. So we've got things like food security, willpower, attitude, family, culture, education, etc., time, things like that. So these are all a range of factors that make dietary change a really difficult thing. So in order to draw conclusions, so the actual skill, if we go back to the very first slide, is to draw conclusions. To draw a conclusion, it's really important that you are aware that there are a range of factors that contribute to food intake. So when presented with, say, stimulus material or case studies or data, ensure that you reference multiple factors. You're not just saying it's a standalone factor. It's really important to acknowledge that there's many challenges to changing dietary behavior. And it's generally the reason someone doesn't make changes to their diet is due to a combined impact of factors. An example of this, so someone who may lack cooking skills may be able to make dietary changes if they can afford a healthy cooked meal delivery service. But if income is low, these factors together may then reduce the ability of the individual to make healthy changes to their food intake. So again, someone's attitude might be, or they might have the willpower, but if their family and their culture is cooking specific foods and they have to stick to that, well, then that's going to be really hard for them to change. So it's just important. Drawing conclusion is a more of a higher order thinking skill, and you need to consider kind of all points of view. What do you need to show? What's your second exam skill for this particular little skill? So you must understand each factor. So the factors on the previous slide, like personal preference, family, willpower, things like that. How can they act as a challenge for bringing about dietary change? It is important to remember that the challenges to dietary change are generally due to a combined range of factors, which I've already gone over, but it's just really important that you are aware of that and that you are using that when you're applying this to case studies or data questions. I would recommend going through each of the factors and just making a little summary of each as well in your own time. All right, your last skill. So let's go through a practice question. So identify 2 challenges of dietary change and discuss how they may have contributed to less than 4% of the population consuming enough vegetables and legumes each day. 4 marks. So our marking breakdown. Step 1, you're identifying a challenge in bringing about dietary change. Step 2, apply this to explaining how it may act as a barrier for adequate consumption of vegetables and legumes. And then you are completing the same thing. Just be mindful of double dipping here. So let's go through this together. So culture/influence of family. So there's my step 1. Family and culture shape many of our food experiences. There are certain cultural or religious backgrounds that may have traditional foods that have been consumed throughout many generations. If families do not cook vegetables and legumes, or if they are not foods used throughout a certain culture, this could reduce the consumption of them for the individuals. Willpower. An individual may not have the willpower to consume vegetables and legumes and prefer the taste and consumption of energy-dense foods high in sugar and fat. Not having the motivation to choose these foods would therefore reduce the overall consumption of them in their diets each day. So notice how the discussion part of it, it's more than just one sentence. I have really gone into detail there, and I've really, I guess, that skill around that drawing, that conclusion is come through there. So it has to be in that level of depth of discussion.